Chapter 8 of the Manless Worlds by Murray Leinster. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8 Pitched Battle. Every man in every city of the capital planet of the Empire was instantly struck motionless. From the gross and corpulent Emperor himself down to the least considered scoundrel of each city's slums. Every man felt his every muscle go terribly and impossibly rigid. Every man was helpless and convulsed, and the women were unaffected. On Sanab, too, which was the capital of a civilization which considered women inferior animals, the women had not been encouraged to be intelligent. For a long time, they were merely bewildered. They were afraid to try to do anything to assist their men. Those with small boy children, doubtless, were the first to dare to use their brains. It was unquestionably the mother of a small boy gone terribly motionless, who desperately set out in search of help. She reasoned fearfully that since her own city was full of agonized statues, which were men, perhaps in another city there might be aid. She tremblingly took a land car and desperately essayed to convoy her son to where something might be done for him. And she found that in the open space beyond the city he recovered from immobility to a mere howling discomfort. As the city was left farther behind, he became increasingly less unhappy, and at last was perfectly normal. But it must have been hours before that discovery became fully known, so that mothers took their boy children beyond the range of the small cases dropped from the skies. And then wives dutifully loaded their helpless husbands into land cars or into freight conveyors, and so got them out to where they could rage in unbridled fury. The emperor and his court were probably last of all to be released from the effects of the disciplinary circuit broadcasts by mere distance. The empire was reduced to chaos. For 50 miles about every bomb, it was impossible for any man to move a muscle. For 75, it was torment. No man could go within 100 miles of any of the small objects dropped from the Starshine and her sister ships without experiencing active discomfort. Obviously, the cities housed the machinery of government and the matter transmitters by which the empire communicated with its subject worlds, and the food synthesizers, and the shelters in which men were accustomed to live, and the baths, and lecture halls, and amusement centers in which they diverted themselves. Men were barred from such places absolutely. They could not govern, nor read, nor have food or drink or bathe or even sleep upon comfortable soft couches. For the very means of living they were dependent upon the favor of women, because women were free to go anywhere and do anything, while men had to stay in the open fields like cattle. The foundation of the civilization of Greater Sanab was shattered, because women abruptly ceased to be merely inferior animals. The defenses of that one planet were non-existent, and even the 4 ships just taken off went down recklessly to the seemingly unharmed cities, to land with monstrous crashes, and every man in them helpless. The ships were out of action for as long as the broadcast should continue. But the fleet of Ades rendezvoused at Ades and again put out into space. They divided now and attacked the subjugated planets. They had no weapons save the devices which every government in the galaxy used. It was as if they fought a war with the nightsticks of policemen, but the disciplinary circuit, which made governments absolute, by the most trivial of modifications became a device by which men were barred from cities, and therefore from government. All government ceased. Active warfare by the Empire of Sanab became impossible. Space yards, armories, spaceships grounded, and spaceships as they landed from the void, every facility for war or rule in an empire of 20 planets, became useless without the killing of a single man and without the least hope of resistance. Only a long while since, a squadron of Sanabian warships had headed out for Ades as a part of a program of expansion of the empire. It had lifted from Sanab II, then the thriving, comfortable capital of the empire, and gone into overdrive on its mission. The distance to be covered was something like 30 light years. Overdrive gave a speed 200 times that of light, which was a very high speed indeed, and had sufficed for the conquest of a galaxy in the days when the human race was rising. But even 30 light years at that rate required 6 weeks of journeying in the stress space of overdrive. During those 6 weeks, of course, there could be no communication with home base. So the squadron bound for Ades had sped on all unknowing and unconscious, while Kiev 5 was beamed and all its men killed, and while the Starshine had essayed a return journey from the second galaxy, and then sped crazily to universes beyond men's imagining and returned, and while the midget fleet of Ades wrecked the empire in whose service the travelers set out to do murder. The journeying squadron, every ship wrapped in the utter unapproachability of faster-than-light travel, was oblivious to all that had occurred. Its separate ships came out of overdrive some 40 million miles from the solitary planet Ades, lonelily circling its small remote sun. The warships of Sanab had an easier task in keeping together on overdrive than ships of the Starshine class on transmitter drive. But even so, they went back to normal space 40 million miles from their destination, 2 seconds journey on overdrive, to group and take final counsel. Kim Rindell, in the Starshine, flashed back from the last of the 20 planets of Sanab as 6 monster ships emerged from seeming nothingness. The Starshine's detectors flicked over to the danger signal strength. Alarm gongs clanged violently. The little ship hurtled past a monster at a bare 200 miles distance, and there was another giant 1,000 miles off, and 2 others a 5th and 6th. The 6 ships drew together into battle formation. Their detectors, too, showed the Starshine, more as other midgets flicked into being, returning from their raid upon the Empire. They also registered upon the detector screens of the battle fleet. The fighter beams of the ships flared into deadliness. They were astounded, no doubt, by the existence of other spacecraft than those of Sanab, but as the little ships flung at them furiously, the fighting beams raged among them. Small, agile craft vanished utterly as the death beams hit, thrown into transmitter drive before the crews could die. But the Sanabians could not know that. They drove on, grandly, ruthlessly. This planet alone possessed spacecraft and offered resistance. It appeared only normal that all the men on Ades should die. Now it became essential. The murder fleet destroyed, apparently, the tiny things which flung themselves recklessly and went on splendidly to bathe the little planet in death. The midgets performed prodigies of valor. They flung themselves at the giants with the small, hard objects that had destroyed an empire held loosely to the outside of their hulls. When the death beam struck and they vanished, the small, hard objects went hurtling on. They could have been missiles. They traveled at miles per second, but meteor repellers flung them contemptuously aside once they were no longer parts of a spacecraft with drives in action. The little ships tried to ram, and that was impossible. They could do nothing but make threatening dashes, and the giants went on toward Ades. From 40 million miles to 30 millions, the enemy squadron drove on with its tiny antagonist darting despairingly about it. At 30 millions, Kim commanded his followers to flee ahead to Ades to give warning and to take on board what refugees they could. But there were 19 million souls on Ades. At most, a million had crowded through to Terra Nova in the second galaxy, and they could do next to nothing. At 20 million of miles, some of the midgets were back with cases of chemical explosive. They strewed them in the path of the Juggernaut ships, with no velocity of their own, almost stationary in space. Someone had thought they might not activate the Sanabian repellers, but that thought was futile. The repeller beams stabbed at them with the force of collisions. The chemical explosives flashed luridly in emptiness and made swift expanding clouds of vapor. Of the tenuity of comets' tails, the enemy ships came on. At 10 million miles, 2 unmanned ships, guided by remote control, flashed furiously toward the leading warcraft. They at least should be able to ram. Repeller beams which focused upon them were neutralized by the space torpedo's drives. They drove in frenziedly. But as they drew closer, the power of the repeller beams rose to incredible heights and overwhelmed the power of the little ship's engines, and shorted the field-generating coils and blew out the motors, and the guided missiles were hurled away, broken hulks. The fleet reached a mere 5 million miles from the planet Ades. Its separate members had come to realize their invincibility against all the assaults that could be made against them by the defending forces, unexpected as they were, of this small world. The fleet divided to take up appropriate stations above the planet and direct their projectors of annihilation downward. They would wipe out every living male upon the planet's surface. They would do it coldly, remorselessly, without emotion. Presently, the planet would become part of an empire which, in fact, had ceased to function. The action of the fleet would not only be horrible, it would be futile, but its personnel could not know that. The giant ships took position and began to descend. Odd little blue-white glows appeared in the atmosphere far below. They seemed quite useless, those blue-white glows. The only effect that could at once be ascribed to them was the sudden vanishing of a dozen little ships preparing to make for the 100th time despairing dashes at the monsters. Those little ships winked out of existence, gone into transmitter drive. And then the big ships wavered in their flight. Automatic controls seemed to take hold. They checked in their descent and presently were motionless. A roar of triumph came to Kim Rindell's ears from the space phone speaker in the Starshine's control room. The mayor of Stidham bellowed in exultation. "We got 'em, by space, we got 'em." "Something's happened to them," said Kim. "What?" "I'm sending up a couple shiploads of women," rumbled the mayor of Stidham zestfully. "Women from Kiev 5. They'll take over. Remember, you had us go to ground to salvage the two ships that crashed there. They bounced when they landed. They shook themselves apart and spilled themselves in little pieces instead of smashing to powder. We picked up half a dozen projectors that could be repaired, all neatly tuned to kill men and leave women unharmed. We brought them back to Ades and mounted 'em. Brought 'em up here with wives for my 4 sons and promises of vengeance for the other women whose men were murdered. We just gave those devils a dose of the medicine they had for us. Those ships are coffins, Kim Rindell. Every man in the crew is dead, but no man can go aboard until their beams are cut off. I'll send up the women from Kiev 5 to board them. They'll attend to things. If any man's alive, they'll slit his throat for him." End of chapter 8.